this morning, please give us a few minutes while we wait for others to join in. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour at the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question. And we'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over on Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you might have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those questions and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch the other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our Facebook page to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Docent Halmerson, who will be presenting Understanding Portraiture from Renaissance to Rococo. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll turn things over to you, Docent Halmerson.
Thank you so much, Renata. We're going to try to stick to a little bit of a tighter schedule. I know in the past I've been going over a little bit, and so I will try to stop right when Renata comes on to see if there are any questions, which we really encourage you to ask. We really do enjoy questions. You know, one thing I wanted to address really quickly is somebody had asked in a prior lecture about rings. Rings for married women, let's say during the Baroque or the Renaissance. And I did a little deep dive on that. So when we come upon paintings where the rings are shown, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The other thing I wanted to tell you is there's so many wonderful portraits during this time. And one that I deeply regret not including, and I just hope if you take a moment to do a little dive on this one, and it is the self-portrait of the great Northern Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer. It was done in 1500. And he had already been to Venice, I believe, at that time, and then he went back. But it's the most astounding portrait. He faces you and you see every detail. So if you get a chance, please do a little research. Albrecht Dürer self-portrait 1500. The painting we're looking at right now is by Anthony van Dyck, the great Anthony van Dyck, and is of Mary Villiers, an aristocrat. We will specifically talk about this a little bit later in the presentation. This is, of course, our very own Timken painting, and it's a very inspiring one, a very interesting one. There's a lot of mystery and intrigue about this painting, and of course, we will talk about that. In general, a portrait is defined as a depiction of a particular individual. And the tradition of European portraiture really extends back to antiquity. Remember, the Renaissance was a rebirth of interest in ideals of antiquity, Greco-Roman antiquity. And so they look back at things like Roman portraits that were pretty ubiquitous in Italy at the time, sculptural portraits in particular. And I do want to say that because of the expansive content in this topic, we do want to limit it to three eras in art. And I also, of course, am not doing sculpture. I don't generally do sculpture because the Timken is based primarily on painting. So we know that these Fayum portraits, which were done by in Greco-Roman times, and they were done in the areas of Egypt. They were found in Egypt. They're funerary portraits called Fayum, because they were found in the Fayum region. Why I mentioned that is because those are some of the oldest portraits that have been found. Portraiture does go back something like 5,000 years. Now, portraiture can do a lot of things. It can express your power. We're going to look at a portrait of one of the kings of France, for example. It can express your interests. You can have attributes that show things like books. We're going to show one where a judge holds a law book to show some of the interests or inclinations that he has. So it can show power. It can show your interests. It can show human emotion. But generally, the portraits that we're going to look at do come from more of the aristocratic realm. Not to say that painters like Frans Hals, Rembrandt, uh, others didn't paint the middle class or, let's say, even the working class, but it's primarily the aristocratic members who can pay for portraiture. So in the early part of the later part of the medieval times, for example, portraiture was found in a very restricted way. What I mean by that is you generally could see portraits in as the donors in a triptych, for example. So you would have the center portion, which would be of a religious nature, and because the Catholic Church was paying for most of them. And then on the side panels or on the outside of the panels, you would often see the donors who contributed. But as we start to get into the Renaissance, we begin to think about the idea of humanism. So, what is humanism? Well, it's that individuals have beauty and attributes and rights and intellect that are not, that need to be represented. And it's not only the Catholic Church that has control of human thought, it's also personal and philosophical ideals. So, as the decline of the Catholic Church began, with the Protestant Reformation, for example, 1517, we begin to see that humanism takes center stage. And where does it evolve? Well, Petrarch, for example, the great Italian humanist, he lived from 1304 to 1374. He was very instrumental in the evolution of art in the sense that he promoted the humanistic interests. Later, when we get to the 15th century, we have the great northern philosopher and theologian who was named Erasmus. And he lived from 1466 to 1536. So again, these humanistic tendencies, set the stage. Now, sometimes artists, when they were painting portraits, would do something very clever. They would elongate and extend the physical being of these people. So they were elongated and they were beautiful. And so many people gravitated toward these portrait painters like Anthony van Dyck, for example, who knew how to create a very elegant, elongated body. And another thing I wanted to also mention that between 14th century and the 17th century, we really begin to see a much more naturalistic concept in portraiture. And how we see that is with the great Jan van Eyck. So Jan van Eyck was one of the greatest artists who ever lived, and he was, along with Paetus Christus and Roger van der Weyden and Robert Campin, the early champions of Northern Renaissance art. And he worked primarily in the city of Bruges. And what I wanted, first we'll talk a little bit about him, and then we'll show you how he extended sort of the humanism in portraits and learn a little bit more specifically about his work. So, as I said, he was one of the founding members of early Netherlandish painting. He was from a Dutch region, Van Eyck, but then he went into Bruges. He painted for Philip the Good, and he painted for the Burgundian court. So remember, the Burgundian court at this time was in charge of the Netherlandish region before the Habsburg takeover. And the Burgundian court was based in Brussels. However, Belgium, I'm going there in a week and a half, is a very small country. And so it was not unheard of for these aristocrats swarming around Philip the Good and the Valois French aristocrats. They traveled. They went to Bruges. They went to Ghent. So Bruges was a very wealthy city. There was trading. The Italians were coming in and doing a lot of merchants were trading, banking, things were happening. And the Burgundian court was very well respected because they really collected a lot of art and sponsored quite a few artists. Now, Jan van Eyck did a lot of religious paintings, but he also did secular paintings too. And he advanced a few things very importantly in the development of art, and not just in portraiture, art in general. One being the advancement of oil painting. He did not invent it, but he advanced the use of glazing and other techniques that really made it more exquisite, the use of oil painting. He trained other artists, for example, the great Paetus Christus. And he also really promoted a couple other things, the use of naturalism and realism. We can really see this in this self-portrait of him. himself. Now, it's not been proven that this is a self-portrait, but most art historians would agree that this is a portrait of Jan van Eyck. It was said that by the time this portrait was painted, 1433, he was just starting to edge toward middle age. He wasn't quite 40, and he was already a very well-established painter. But it was said that maybe he hung this in his developed studio to encourage people to buy his work. So he looks at us with a very strong and a very intellectual face. You can see the lines around the eyes. Talk about realism. And you see also the beginning of interest in light. Look how the light kind of falls onto the cheekbones and highlights his facial characteristics. His head is a little bigger than the body, kind of that lollipop head, but it actually gives it a more striking appearance. He wears an exquisite fur sort of a mantle or jacket, and then he wears a chaperon. A chaperon is a medieval headdress. Remember, we're really in the early Renaissance. A chaperon was kind of like a tent headdress and very common. If you recall, I showed last week Saint Eligius in the Jeweler's Shop by Petrus Christus, one of the first genre paintings ever done. The jeweler wears the chaperon. But here, Jan van Eyck has had to tie it up because, of course, he was painting. So this is a third of the size of his actual body. And it really shows us his interest in naturalism and his intelligence. One of my favorite early Renaissance portraits. Now we're going to go to one I did talk about a little bit last time, and I think it's worth repeating because I could look at this Arnolfini portrait forever. It's just so amazing. So let's talk a little bit about this. I know we talked last time, maybe you heard it, but I think it's worth repeating. So this is, we think, is a marriage portrait. However, there's a lot of mystery around this portrait. This couple was actually married, I believe, something like 7 or 8 years before this painting was done. By the time the painting was completed, the wife had already died. And so there's a lot of mystery. Was it really a wedding portrait? We're going to assume it was for the sake of this argument, but again, there's a lot of mystery. So Arnolfini was he came from Lucca. He was part of the upper class merchants that were flooding that city from Italy. And he wasn't so much an aristocrat, but of the upper bourgeois. And why do we know that? Because they're dressed in elegant clothing, but there's not a lot of jewelry. She does wear a ring here and a bracelet and a necklace, but she's not, you'll see when I show you portraits a little bit later, just this plethora of gorgeous jewelry. Her outfits are more simple, but she wears a very elegant gown. And others have asked, is she pregnant? No, she is not pregnant. This gown was meant to be held by a servant. And because a servant is not present in the painting in this bedroom setting, she holds the dress in her hand. Now, some people would say that this is what's called the left-handed marriage because he holds her left hand, which means that it might have been a less status marriage, but again, that's not proven. And she does come from a pretty wealthy family. So again, that's one of the mysteries. So we have the red bedchamber kind of foreshortened, sort of like a coffin, a little bit. People died in childbirth. We have some iconography and symbolism. So iconography and symbolism kind of overlaps in that symbolism would be maybe that he holds her hand with love. Iconography would be right here on the finial. We have St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. We have oranges iconographically representing the fact that Bruges had a lot of acquisition of things coming from other countries. There was a lot of travel going on at that time. And then we have a rose bush out here, which shows love. The little Fido, fidelity, and the shoes that are off represents the sanctity of the marriage bed. We also have something that's really important, this gorgeous convex mirror. Why is that so important? Well, first of all, it shows a brilliance of the artist, and his signature is here. And it shows also the ability to show reflected light, to show depth, very important. And we have two witnesses to the scene. Now, 200 years later, fast forward to Velázquez, Las Meninas, and we're going to see something that relates to Las Meninas a little bit later. Velázquez was so inspired by this particular painting. Remember the cross-pollination of the Habsburgs and the Netherlandish region. So he was aware of this painting and he used it to great advantage in Las Meninas. Just a couple more things, because I do tend to go over in the very beginning and then I find I rush toward the end, and I don't really want to do that. So we have the Passions of Christ shown here around the mirror, and then we also have a candelabra. And the candelabra has one handle, and that would be the presence of God in this marriage chamber, excuse me. So one of the most important dual portraits ever painted in the history of Western art. Now we're going to go to, after I switch back and advance it, we're going to go to the work of the great Roger van der Weyden. So as I mentioned, Roger van der Weyden and Jan van Eyck and Petrus Christus and Robert Campin were the early Northern Renaissance painters, the great Northern Renaissance painters. And then, of course, later we have a whole new generation, Lucas Cranach, Abracadabra, excuse me, and a lot of other great painters. But so we're looking at more of the early part of the Renaissance. And so Roger van der Weyden was probably of French origin, but he eventually settled, he's from Tournai, French inspired, and then he moves to Brussels. And that's where he does most of his career. However, he did go to Bruges, he did work and know Jan van Eyck, and he also went to Italy and painted for some of the aristocratic families. In Ferrara, for example, he went to the d'Este family, he went to the Medici court, so he was very well respected. What does he bring to art? Well, he brings a lot. He brings emotion, and he brings the idea of pushing the subject to the foreground of the painting, which is a very interesting concept, because it really heightens the ability to see the characteristics of the face, gives it more dynamism, and it's a very effective method. And there's this idea of emotion. Now, of course, in this beautiful painting, we don't have a lot of emotion, but we do see an exquisite woman, and we know she's probably from the upper classes, the Burgundian court. Why? Well, let's look at a couple characteristics. First of all, it was known in the Burgundian court that French-inspired look, which is a very high forehead, and the women used to actually sort of shave the forehead to give it a higher, elongate it, and then they would also thin the eyebrows. So you had almost this expanse of upper quadrant of the face. They thought that was a sign of beauty, and they put the hair in a very ornate coiffure. She has exquisite pale skin. The light seems to fall directly on her, again, on her cheekbones, and a gorgeous mouth, just beautiful mouth. And this very sheer gossamer veil. Again, that shows her upper class standing, because to create that kind of gossamer veil would take a lot of skill. She wears a nice dress here, but we also know the aristocratic image is from this delicate gold belt. Such fine work. The rings. So I did some research. In the 15th century, upper class women did receive wedding rings, but they don't always, oftentimes they're on the baby finger. Now, in this case, not so much, but in the 16th century, particularly in Italy, then you see a lot of exchanging of rings. That's when men and women would also exchange rings in a wedding ceremony. So rings were really pretty popular. For time's sake, we'll move on to the wonderful Petrus Christus. Now, Petrus Christus, there's a remarkable painting in the Timken, The Death of the Virgin. I hope that you go, because several of the paintings that we're going to talk about today are in the Timken's collection. Petrus Christus was a student of Jan van Eyck. In fact, after Jan van Eyck's death and Hans Memling's death, he took over sort of as the master painter of Bruges. And he was really good at religious paintings and portrait paintings. He did manuscript illumination and miniatures. And that's something that Jan van Eyck and Hubert van Eyck also trained because, of course, before 1440, books were handmade. And so they needed skill. Books were made with a group of people. You had people who wrote the text, you had bookbinders, you had page illuminators. So many people were part of the creation of a book. So you had to have great artists coming and doing the manuscript illuminations. Let's look at this incredible painting. I love it. It's so mysterious to me. Well, first of all, she's an odd-looking young woman. Kind of odd, right? Not beautiful in a traditional sense, but very elegant and interesting. Her hat is made of velvet, and it has a cloth element to it. Again, this is a very upper class woman. It was, as I said earlier, it's most likely upper class women would have great artists paint them. They had the money. They were in that sphere of circle of artists. And she also wears a very elegant chemise with a delicate three-strand necklace. Something that was shown in the Roger van der Weyden painting was this gossamer, like a little shawl, a gossamer shawl. Again, the most delicate piece of clothing. And so it would take just utmost skill. Her hat shows a bit of the strawberry blonde hair. And her face, there's a lot of light that falls on it. And her eyes are rather mismatched. Again, but I love those sort of almond shape. Now, something really interesting in the first few portraits I showed you, you really don't, there's no attributes, meaning that she's not holding anything. And they push the subject, as Roger van der Weyden did, to the foreground. What Pages Christus does is a little differently. He poses her with a backdrop. And what is the backdrop? The backdrop is a plaster wall with a type of molding, waistcoating, I guess it's called, which is kind of remarkable because in those days, houses were often made of wood. So to have this plastered wall that's painted and very a lot of technique involved to make this kind of wall showed, again, that upper class position in society. They think that she might have been the granddaughter of Sir Talbot, who I'm going to show you a reference to a little bit later on. So we'll move away from this exquisite painting and we'll go to probably the most important portrait ever painted in Western art. I have heard so many times people go to the Louvre, and I know many of you have, and you go and you see the Mona Lisa and you say, it's kind of small, it's very crowded to look at it. Is it that remarkable? It is that remarkable. Every time I've been looking at this painting for decades in person, and slides and books and PowerPoints, and every time I look at it, I'm more and more mesmerized. So we'll talk about why. So a little bit about Leonardo da Vinci. Most of you know quite a bit about him. He was a scientist, a thinker, a painter. He had beautiful volumes of beautiful drawings. He did many more drawings than paintings. Not that many paintings are extant. He traveled a lot throughout Italy. He was born in the town of Vinci. He worked in Milan. He worked in Florence. He worked in Rome. He eventually went to the French court and worked for King Francis I, and then he died there. He died in his 60s. And he was revered. He was revered by younger high Renaissance artists like Michelangelo and Raphael. He trained with some great artists like Verrocchio, Ghirlandaio, and he moved around and found new interests. He developed military weaponry, bridge design, a flying machine. He was known to look at corpses so he could understand the human body. One of the greatest minds ever. And he paints this exquisite La Gioconda. Mona Lisa, Mona meaning like madam or signora, so it gives her some status. She was of an Italian upper class family. It's kind of an archetypal masterpiece. There's an enigmatic expression that kind of captivates us. But look at the light that he uses. So Leonardo promoted the idea of sfumato, smokiness. If you look around her eyes and her neck, and the facial characteristics, there's a sort of a smoky light, which is quite different than two other light sources that we have talked about. And I'll just reiterate just for a moment. And they are tenebrism and chiaroscuro. So chiaroscuro is a use of light against dark, but it's used to promote pushing the subject matter forward and creating dimensionality. Tenebrism, which is often seen in Spanish painting, most often if we look at the great Murillo, for example, the crucifixion in the Timken collection, lots of tenebrism, a black background that is meant to show Jerusalem, and then this white body of Christ on the crucifixion. So it's that really high dynamic light against dark. But sfumato is meant to give it a more mysterious sort of smokiness. Another thing, he uses this aristocratic woman to almost mirror some of his paintings of Mary. She almost has that quality that Mary possessed, beauty and quietness. Her hands are in a very quiet gesture. And I've told you this a million times, but I have to point it out here again, that the hands are the most difficult part of a human body to paint. Ask any artist, I've heard it many times, and the face would be next. Look at these hands. These are almost perfect. And she holds them in a quiet posture. Now, she's sitting in a special chair called a ponzetto. A ponzetto, they're made during the Renaissance in particular, and they were sort of almost like a little sort of barrel-like, and they had armrests. So she's sitting like that. She's also sitting in an open loggia, like a balcony. And you can see an element of it right here. And then, of course, this exquisite composite or ethereal landscape. Very atmospheric, very illusionistic, so skilled. Now, people often talk about her enigmatic smile, but I want to point out something. During the Renaissance and the Baroque, you did not see a lot of people smiling for a couple reasons. Bad dental care. We just didn't have it then. And also, think about it. If you were to have your portrait done and you were to have it done even over several hours, several days, even months, perhaps, you would be, not that you would be in one position for that time period, of course, that's ridiculous, but sitting with an open smiling face is a lot more difficult. But it probably was the dental issue. So we're going to go to the work of Raphael, another great high Renaissance artist. Unfortunately, Raphael died young. He died 36 or 37. He died of a plague-like condition. Remember, plague goes through Europe. It decimates Siena in the 13th century, and it goes throughout Europe in the 15th century, and there's all kinds of plague. So he was a victim of plague. So he was a younger contemporary of Leonardo and Michelangelo. They were all great high Renaissance artists. Raphael's is slightly different than the others in that he has sort of an easy, harmonious way about him, very graceful, almost feminine in the qualities. If you look at some of his Madonnas, oh my God, Madonna with the goldfinch, the beauty of her face is nonpareil, as they say. People called Raphael the Prince of Painters. He was beloved. He was lovely. They said he was articulate and handsome, and people just wanted to be near him. And he was so talented. His father died when he was 11, and he went to study with the great Perugino. And so many people at first used to think Raphael's work and Perugino's work sort of crossed over, but soon enough, Raphael distinguished himself. So he too uses the softly modeled forms, a little bit like Leonardo, who he was influenced by, who was an older artist at the time, loved the softly shadowed and modulated forms. In 1508, he did go to Rome and he worked under the Pope, and the Pope, helped him advance his career. He even did some drawings for the Sistine Chapel. He worked on tapestries and paintings. And so he was called to Rome by the Pope. And when he was in Rome, he saw a lot of antiquities. And remember, during the High Renaissance, this is interest in the rebirth of culture. They're interested in humanism. They're interested in what the Greeks and Romans talked about in antiquity and art and perspective and mathematics and writing. There's so many philosophies. So they were really interested in these great classical thinkers. And of course, Raphael was part of that. So here we have, speaking of humanism and great thinkers, we have a portrait of Baldassare Castiglione. Now, let me say, many people think this is one of the most beautiful and most important portraits done in the High Renaissance. This man was a friend of Raphael. He traveled together, and they traveled in the same circles, and he was about 20 years older than Raphael, but Raphael really liked him. He promoted Raphael's work. And so this portrait of his friend, this humanist, this thinker, this affluent gentleman, really inspired Raphael. Their friendship was very important to him. Why was this portrait done? Well, he was a diplomat, Castiglione, and he was asked to go to a couple of places. He was asked to go to England to deliver a portrait of someone else, and I believe that was done by Raphael, but I can't say for sure. But this portrait done by Raphael was meant to be a substitute for this individual when he traveled to Rome for a while to bring other paintings to Rome and also to do some work sort of diplomatically. So it was said that this portrait was done as a substitute for his family, for his wife. I think that's sort of a charming idea. It's a pyramidal composition. You can see from the broader shoulders up to the head. He wears a velvet cloche. It's a very practical portrait. He doesn't show any attributes, really. There might be some jewelry. I can't really say for sure what that is, but there's no attributes. He's not holding a book. He's not holding a painting. We just know that he's a thinker. His clothing is quite remarkable. It's wintertime, most likely because of the warmth of the clothing. I love the more monochromatic palette, the grays and dark tonalities. There's a lot of volume to the shoulders. And it is quite a remarkable composition. One of the great artists, Titian, who we're going to look at in just momentarily, was very, very much influenced by the portraits of Raphael. But before we go on to Titian, we're just going to go to a Venetian painting, and this is by the great Bartolomeo Veneto. Veneto, from the Veneto region, from that region, was settled mostly in Venice and painted there. This is in our very own Timken collection, quite remarkable painting. So he worked in the Veneto and Lombardy and Venice. He was a pupil of the Bellini, probably Gentili. There was the great Bellini family that was set in Venice, Gentile, Giovanni Bellini. Jacopo was the father. And then from that, we have Giorgione and Titian. So this was a dynastic, amazing set of artists. Now, they learned a lot about color from the use of oil painting from people like Albrecht Dürer, because Albrecht Dürer had been in Italy twice before this painting was ever done, quite a bit before. So they were looking at the development of oil painting. And one thing I was remiss in pointing out, that Pagus Christus, who was a student of Jan van Eyck, his great contribution to Western art was a single point perspective. Now, single point perspective had been used by the Romans in some of their four styles of wall painting, but he advanced it in Western art. So we have to give credit to Pagus Christus. So I apologize for that digression, but I just want to show you that the Italians and the Northern artists were cross-pollinizing. They saw each other's work and they knew they could learn from it. So we have people like Roger van der Weyden showing artists how to paint with oil painting. And, we have a lot of that. So there's a lot of influence. When Albrecht Dürer came to Venice, it was about 1500s. And as I mentioned, that portrait was done, the one from 1500, I think you should look at, was done around that time. So he worked with techniques to show artists some things in linear perspective, but also color. So there's a lot of back and forth. So this artist was a contemporary of the great Veronese, and it's a woman of the court of Isabel d'Este, aristocratic court. And it was done in her youth. She is positioned near a beautiful red velvet drape. She wears an extremely ornate costume. We have these lapis beads. This hair is pushed up into this elaborate headpiece that is made of human hair and festooned with ribbons. She wears a glove and rings. The gloves, again, we've kind of gone back and forth on this because the gloves are in the left hand, and that would be I mean, the way the gloves are held, sorry, the way the gloves are held indicates that it might not have been falconeering gloves, but they're very thick, and falconeering was a big sport at this time, so most likely they are falconeering gloves, where the falcon and the raptor bird would alight on the glove. I'm going to move on just because of time, and we're going to look at a very remarkable portrait by a woman, Sofonisba Anguinsola. I always have a difficult time with her name. And this is a painting with her teacher, Bernardino Campi. So she studied with Campi. She was such a clever, brilliant artist. She was a noblewoman, came from aristocratic circles. She was a prodigy. Her talents were known. Even Michelangelo, Vasari, Anthony van Dyck studied her work. Her father was a humanist and advanced the idea of women being educated and thinking and producing great work. So he promoted her, which was kind of unique at that time. She spent a lot of time at the court of Philip II in Spain. She was a lady in waiting to the queen there, and she also taught the queen how to paint. So she was a teacher, a painter, an aristocrat, but she really captured the personality of the artist. This is such a clever dual portrait. And they're both looking at us, aren't they? They're both looking at us. So she self-portrait, she wears the dress of a Cremona noblewoman, this beautiful red. And it's kind of witty, isn't it? It's a very witty portrait. Now, something that we want to look at kind of carefully is the three arms. Well, when you first look at it, three arms, I don't quite see that. Well, I will show you. So let's look here. This is the shoulder and arm. We don't see the hand. We see a second hand, and then we have a third hand right here. And we think what happened was it was like the pintamento of a hand that wasn't quite done the way she wanted it, but it was never completely erased, so it was kept in the painting. One of the hands has this exquisite ruby bracelet, and then we have earrings and beautiful hair and an immaculate dress with embroidery. It's just a fun and an amazing portrait. It just showed her skill. There were societal restrictions too on women, and it's remarkable that she could be captured painting her teacher. Because usually before this time, I mean, a lot of times when women painted, they painted in monasteries. They didn't really have a lot of opportunities to have commissioned portraits, and she suffered from that as well. So a very clever painting. We're going to go on now to the great work of a later Venetian painter, and that is Titian. Titian is probably one of the most important painters who ever lived. He was born in a medieval town near the Austrian border, and he worked in Lombard and then a lot in Venice, mostly. But because of his great skill, he did travel. He could do mythological paintings. He could do religious paintings, portraits. His methods were exceptional. His color was, again, nonpareil. In fact, his colors were considered some of the most beautiful ever done. The Venetian painters, I love the Venetian Renaissance painters because they had such a dedication to creating beautiful color. Now, the Florentine painters in the Renaissance were more about line and form, as the Venetians really gravitated toward color. Not that they didn't cross over sometimes, but color was very prominent among the Venetian painters. So he was hired by a lot of aristocratic families to paint, and he paints this beautiful portrait of a lady in a white dress. Now, about 5 years ago, just before COVID, I had the opportunity to go just up to the Norton Simon Museum, and it came from Dresden, this painting. And I literally spent probably an hour looking at it. It's just that beautiful. And it's a study in white. And so I'm going to fast forward to the 19th century. And someone once asked, I believe it was Degas, about the use of white. And he said something like, there are more than 100 shades of white. Standard belief is about 150 shades, but really it's thousands, 100,000, if you really take on every nuance of color. But here we have a beautiful study in white, different whites, the creamy whites, the stark whites, the whites of the pearls, the little bit gray white, the golden light around the sleeves. So it's a study in white. So who is this beautiful young woman? She was probably, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say, he did do a lot of painting for the Habsburg court. So that's pretty important to mention. She's a very beguiling young woman, and we don't know exactly who she was. Some think it was his mistress. Some think it was his illegitimate daughter. Some think it was his daughter by marriage. And so we really don't know. She holds what's called a ventrole. It's a Venetian fan and very common. She has beautiful pearls. Her dress is elegant. She has beautiful jewelry. Remember, the pearls were the bling of that time period. And she looks at us with sort of this mysterious look. There's so much white in this painting, but where do we find highlights? Her rosy cheeks as the light falls across the cheeks and that rosy red lips. So it's a very remarkable portrait. And as I say, I'm very glad that I had an opportunity to see it in California. I love this portrait. So this is by Paolo Veronese. So he was a second generation Venetian painter. Of course, Titian worked with excuse me, some of the Bellini brothers. Of course, he worked with Giorgione, who was his teacher. But Veronese represents a little bit older generation. Titian was an older generation, but Veronese was a latter, along with Tintoretto, a Venetian painter. And he paints this marvelous portrait of a young aristocrat and a greyhound. One thing I do want to mention, I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but when we looked at the Mona Lisa, some people would say, it's small when I saw it at the Louvre, but I do laugh sometimes because there is a magnificent masterpiece by Veronese, a wedding at Cana or marriage at Cana, and it's just around the corner from the Mona Lisa, and it is a magnificent history painting, religious painting. And people always overlook it because they go around the corner to see the Mona Lisa and they forget this brilliant Veronese. So next time you're in Paris, make sure you take a look at it. So he was a generation older, and he really promoted history painting, religious painting, and this idea of mannerism, which was pushing away from the Renaissance and into more elongated, a little more unique characteristics in the painting. So let's just look at this painting carefully. A young nobleman, he has thick and muscular legs, but he's in a dancer's profile. He stands with one knee bent, contrapposto, as it were, and he's got this marvelous greyhound in the gold, and he looks at the hilt of the sword, and we know it's an aristocrat. He's got gold embroidered pantaloons and a ruffled collar and jewelry. He's a young man. Keeps his heels off the ground. He can kind of pivot toward the dog or away from the dog. Now, there used to be an exquisite cerulean blue sky that has faded out, unfortunately. We still see a bit of a landscape down here, quite nice, but this sky was just magnificent, but that is no longer true here. But we do have this gray wall, this elaborate sword. He's a handsome man. He's a young man. And the tonalities of yellow are pretty impressive. So we want to go again to another painting, and this is by Lavinia Fontana. And like the previous artists, and we're going to look at more, she made great advancements in the field of portraiture. She was a brilliant portrait painter. She received many commissions. She was considered equal to males in her ability to paint. She worked for the court. She was married an artist and a nobleman, and he really promoted her career. She made money on her career. So she works for the Bologna nobility. And this is a style of dress found in Bologna among the nobles. They wore red, not white. And this couldn't be more elaborate. Look at the earrings, look at the cross, the lace collar, the exquisite hair. Everything is embroidered. And she has and then again, the rings. And then she has something very unusual. She has an ermine or a mink toggled to her belt, sort of parallel to the little lapdog. And you can see, I'm going to point it out. Here's a gold encrusted face of the mink, and the mink's body is down here. the lapdog. What does the lapdog symbolize? The lapdog symbolizes, of course, fidelity, and the aristocrats really loved having lapdogs. I have to go on to another painting because we're just, I'm taking a little too much time. But Alethea Talbot, remember I showed you a portrait and I said this could be the granddaughter of the Talbot family. And so this is this famous Talbot family. So this woman, Alethea, was she married into this aristocratic family. She also came from a lot of money, and it was a marriage of like dynastic marriage. And she was in many of the royal courts. She loved to travel. She had her own money. So she was a prodigious collector of art. I'm just going to tell you that she collected the works of Rubens, Titian, Van Dyck, Albrecht Dürer, Hans Holbein, Peter Bruegel, massive art collection. She also was one of the first women to ever write a scientific paper. Her father was a scientist and humanist too, and he promoted learning among her. So she traveled along the court. She was aristocratic circles, went to England, over Italy, and collected art. So in this painting, she's sitting with her beautiful, great big dog, and she has in the corner, I don't know if you can see, but in the corner, I can't see it because of the viewers, but there is her her, let's say, her assistant, and he helped her collect art. His name was Sir Dudley Carleton, and he's featured on the right of the painting. Then we have her court gesture and also entertainment. I think we call that a jester, and they're jesters and court entertainers. And then she has this elaborate, beautiful interior. And the attributes somewhat, I mean, we have very detailed Corinthian capitals, almost twisted. And then we have an exquisite landscape. Remember, when we looked at the Mona Lisa, we know that artists like Leonardo were promoting the use of landscape. Giorgione was promoting the use of landscape. So Peter Paul Rubens was one of the greatest artists also to ever live. He was a Baroque master. He traveled with the courts. He painted the Medici family. He was a courtier, a diplomat, a spy. He spoke multiple languages. He actually trained with an aristocratic woman who taught him manners and things like that. And he became well-loved and well-respected throughout the courts of Europe. We only have about 5 or 10 minutes, so I do want to go to the next painting. And this is The Laughing Cavalier by Frans Hals. Now, we have a lovely Frans Hals in the Timken collection. Well, this is probably his most famous one. So Frans Hals was born in Antwerp, today Belgium. I'm going there a week and a half, can't wait. And he gravitated toward the city of Haarlem, just like some of the great landscape painters. And so he was in Haarlem, where he made most of his career, and he was a great portrait painter. He painted groups and the militia groups and portraits of the middle class, because Holland at that time was affluent, very affluent, but more middle class, not aristocratic. It's not a Catholic country anymore. Particularly at this time, the Protestant Reformation has succeeded. It's moved away from the Habsburgs, and it's a Protestant country. So he loved to do children, and he loved to do all manner of people. And this Laughing Cavalier is very impressive. The 26-year-old man is not really laughing, is he? He's smiling. So it's a beautiful smile. Remember, I told you don't often see smiles. But he had this gorgeous upturned mustache. The light falls on his rosy complexion, his curled hair, this wonderful hat. And the embroidery on his costume is incredible. And what are these embroidered elements? Well, they're related to the pleasure and pain of love. So if you look closely, they're the love knots and florals and marine life and all kind of the symbol of caduceus for the medical doctors. And it's just very detailed. But then he also uses a kind of, it's very detailed, even the lace held by a gold pin. But then we have some very gestural brushstrokes. Artists like Manet in the 19th century, fast forward, loved Frans Hals and tried to kind of emulate some of his work. He signs it here in Latin, and then the age, and then the date that he did it. It's a very unusual painting for that time period, and one of the finest. Now, we can't go out without looking at the work of Rembrandt. Van Eycken, we have a masterpiece in the Timken, St. Bartholomew. You might wonder why I didn't do portraits of saints, because the subject matter is so vast. I thought I'd concentrate on people that you might be able to identify or know. So this is an old man in a military costume. And Rembrandt, he did come from a prosperous family, and he did these remarkable paintings. And I know that Renata's going to want to start in like 2 minutes. So I do want to show you how he shows age and frailty a bit in this painting. But I can't go on without just one or two. This is our Mary Villiers, an aristocrat by Anthony van Dyck, who was a student of Rubens. And he paints Mary Villiers at the court. She's a widow. She's a widow at 14. That's why the black ribbons. Her 15-year-old Sir Villiers died of illness, and she is in ribbon. She holds an attribute, which is a flower, which indicates her youth and beauty. Anthony van Dyck worked for the court of James and Charles, and so he was privy to a lot of these people. Now, I do want to show you, we do have to just look at one really quickly. Renata, do we have any questions at this time?
We have a comment from Elliot Marshall. It says, for the boy with the greyhound, he says, it appears that all the light came from a source in the upper left and well out in front of the scene.
And what was the second part? And how, what?
And well out in front of the scene.
Yeah, that is
So
really true. If I have a moment, I'm going to go back, but I hope, bear with me if I could just do this, because I wanted to show a really royal portrait. This, of course, is by the great Velázquez, and he did work for the court in Spain, and he paints this young Teresa, and she is this very same Teresa that is in Las Meninas, one of his greatest paintings, if not his greatest paintings. And she wears this crinoline undergarment that makes her dress profoundly large, and she holds a mink muff and this amazing embroidery and jewelry. And this portrait was meant for her uncle. It's her fiance who was her uncle, and he was head of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's a little strange. And this painting was meant to go to where he was, and she's only 8 at the time. So it's a pretty interesting thing. We have chinoiserie here. We have a beautiful, there's a mirror, I think, or a painting here, and then this elaborate furniture. So we had that one question, Renata. Do we have any others so far?
he also had a little comment for making the mouse a little bit bigger or more colorful, but I would have to look into that to
You
see.
mean so because you
The
mean
cruiser. Hmm.
oh yeah, I'm really sorry about that. I think it's my computer, honestly, because we tried to work on it, and it's my computer. I'm sorry. I'll try to do the best, but again, I know we're going to stop right at 12, but I'm going to keep talking about the paintings. And Renata, just interrupt me or let me know if there's a question, because these two beautiful La Gillier portraits are in the Timken, Madame de Sèvres and Monsieur Paul. This is a Baroque painting by La Gillier. He painted not the top of the aristocracy, because these people still had jobs, like he's a judge, but the judge receives a commission in Lyon, and his wife asked Nicolas La Gillier, got to paint us, and he does it with beautiful sort of rich colors and this elaborate costume. She's got a metal style of armor, which is probably cloth that's been treated. She wears ermine, festooned with flowers. At this time, some of the aristocratic or upper bourgeois women wore flowers, got a little away from jewelry, all the way up pearls here. He's wearing judge's robes, very three-dimensional. And if you wanted your portrait done, you either had La Gillier or I'm going to go on to
Oh, before you start on this one, Ryan S says, heard much on Mona Lisa, but had never heard comparisons to Virgin Mary. Congrats for digging that up. Are there any other Mary portraits from Renaissance times that come to mind?
well, so I would say the Virgin of the Rocks might have been an inspiration that was by Leonardo da Vinci, but this is kind of a segue, but I hope you bear with me because I want to show you something. This portrait about Mary. I just want to mention this because this might be the last one we talk about. So Marie Antoinette and her children. This is by Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, and she was also a great female artist. I try to include as many as I possibly could. So she painted for the court of Louis XVI. And what we find here is this is just before the revolution. And the queen, Marie Antoinette, was not well favored. The beginning of the revolution was happening. And what was also happening is there was, it's called the Diamond Affair. Her credibility really took a dive. In this painting, Vigée Lebrun tries to make Mary look like the Holy Family. She wants to give her a holiness about her. So this is meant to be sort of like a depiction of the Holy Family, even though it's royalty. And we have a cabinet here that's was supposed to be filled with jewels. You don't see any jewels on her. Her jewels are her kids. So that's meant to show her as a great mother, almost like the Virgin Mary with her children, and her jewels are her children, and meant to paint her in a great light. Of course, that didn't last very long because 2 years later, she was guillotined. Now, did we want to, that's the last one, that is Bonaparte, by the way. So I see our time is just about up. Do we have any other questions, Renata? Because it's,
None have popped up.
pardon me?
None have popped up.
Okay, I just want to look really, we have, can you tell me the time, please, Renata? I know we want to.
11:56.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes. I want to go back to the question that someone posed. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to fast forward. We have 2 minutes. I'm going to show you Francois Boucher's. We have a beautiful Boucher in the Timken. This is not the painting in the Timken, but this is a portrait of Madame Pompadour. And she was Louis XV's mistress. She was about 5 years. She was his mistress. And she's festooned with all these roses in her boudoir. And she's holding a book. Well, this was his mistress, but she was said to be a very intelligent woman. She actually helped him on political policy sometimes. Why all the roses? It's kind of a funny story. The palace was pretty malodorous. People didn't bathe. They masked smells with perfumes and herbs and spices, and people didn't bathe very well. She thought that was disgusting. And she promoted bathing. But she also loved roses. So she would cultivate having roses as a scent, but she loved roses for their beauty and their scent. So she's in her boudoir and she's promoting the attributes. We talked about the word attribute. The clock, the little putti here, her refinement, art, but also the books, the quill, the candle that she loved to read. And she was a very knowledgeable and bright woman. And therefore, she's painted with elegance and luxury by Boucher, who did paint. He didn't do a lot of portraits. I mean, he did, but he wasn't known to be a portrait painter, but he does a very clever portrait of her. And are we just about at 12 now, Renata?
Yes, 11:58.
Okay, so we have 1 minute. I'm terrible. I want to show you Gainsborough's Bluebell. I'm kind of going out. This is at the Huntington Library, and he's in a beautiful costume right after Van Dyck. So Gainsborough lives a century later, but he looked at the work of Van Dyck. He paints his assistant, Dupont Gainsborough. I think it's Dupont Gainsborough was his nephew. So we don't really know if this was a rich heir to a fortune or his own nephew. But I'm going to stop there. I love this painting, and you can see it at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. Thank you all for attending. I'm sorry I was a little disjointed today because I had too many portraits to show and not enough time, but we will end at 12. And thank you all. The next talk I will be giving is in the end of April after my trip to Belgium, and I will be talking about the Dutch Baroque. Thank you for coming, by the way.
Yes, thank you all so much. Thank you, Docent Helmerson, for such a fascinating and engaging tour. Before you all go, I would like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our Facebook page. If you would like to find out any further information on future tours being put on by the Timken Museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. Thank you again for joining us all, and thank you, Docent Helmerson, for a wonderful presentation. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thank you, Renata. I hope I'm okay on time.
Yes, perfect.